So this lecture is also about the turn of the century, and in this case, we're going to be focusing on the progressive era and how it's an era for a lot of reform movements trying to change problems in society, and also how one of those important reform movements of the progressive era is the women's suffrage movement or the effort to enfranchise or give women the ballot, the right to vote, because they still are not at this point. We talked about a push to enfranchise black men, but it's still women of all colors and races are not enfranchised in the United States. So we're going to talk a little bit about their efforts to do so to gain the right to vote. But this is the progressive era, about the dates kind of there are the progressive era, very much a very turn of the century type of attitude and type of reform movement. And it's called the progressive era because it really is all about progress. It's a very optimistic type of movement where the thought that everything is always moving forward, that there's always the potential for progress. And it's an ideology that really seeks to progress and to improve American life through activism and government intervention. So, progressivism is all about bringing about good change, progress, solving problems, and doing it by advocating for change, making a big deal about something, drawing attention to it, and then having the government come in and pass a law or pass a regulation that protects those changes. Teddy Roosevelt, he'll become president after William McKinley. William McKinley will be assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt, the famous Rough Rider of the Spanish-American War, he will rise to the office of president, and he's a very big progressive. He loves the idea of moving forward and change, and he's all about adding it in to everything that he does to kind of mix it all up and create a very progressive, forward-looking mindset. So it's a very simple definition of it, but what are some of the characteristics and goals of it? Obviously, the goal of progressivism is improvement of daily life for Americans, but the other characteristics of it, how they go about it, is very unique to the progressive era. One of it is that they're going to try to use a lot of science and technology. They're very optimistic in believing that all of these new advances and new technological changes can be applied to bettering the lives of everybody. And another real characteristic of progressivism is a focus on a lot of the problems that emerged in Gilded Age cities. So the progressives are going to be looking at things like poverty, overcrowded tenements, those tenement buildings, child labor, women's rights, food reform, alcoholism, all sorts of stuff, all these big problems that they see as still unresolved. They're going to try to focus very heavily on that. So it is an era of progressivism, progressive thought, and progressive politics, where the government is going to be more involved than it had been in the past in solving social problems. And part of the way that this gets done, how it makes its way into being codified into law, is through a reform is definitely spearheaded by a process known as muckraking. And muckraking is when people investigate and draw attention to something which is bad or wrong that they see as such. So something like a corrupt politician or corrupt politics, some type of scandal that's hurting Americans, or something shocking and disgusting. One of the most famous things we'll talk a little bit about in just a second of the progressive era is food reform, where there was a lot of issues with meat packing plants where they would process meat for human consumption in very unsanitary conditions. And the idea of the muckrakers was is they did investigative journalism and undercover stuff, and they went into these factories and they drew attention to it. They raked the muck away and revealed the disgusting underbelly so that people were outraged and wanted to see change. That's Teddy Roosevelt there again. He's very easy to caricature. Has a lot of very unique features on his face. He was a big into this idea of muckraking. Like, yes, go out and the big rake of investigation peels back the muck and reveals all of the scandal going on beneath. So the muckrakers were those who raked the muck away and revealed things that needed to change in society, like um, corruption that was making factories dangerous places to work in, or some type of shocking scandal of like covering up how bad food preparation areas and factories were, or exploitative child labor practices. So the muckrakers were those who tried to reveal the truth by raking away the muck that was covering it up. They're kind of the precursors to the whistleblowers of today who try to draw attention to something to encourage public outrage that will then also encourage change. And I mentioned food reform. This is a big one that the progressives tackle because this was something that people felt really needed to change. A big goal of them was to improve sanitation in food preparation areas and food preparation plants. Um, One of the most important pieces of literature of the progressive era is a book by Upton Sinclair. He authors a text called The Jungle in 1906, who published a fictional but based on reality tale about how absolutely nasty the meatpacking industry was. If you've ever read The Jungle, don't do it while you're eating because it's really nasty. It talks about big piles of rotten meat with rats running all over it, and there's carcasses and blood flying all over the place. And basically, the workers just kind of chop the rotten parts off the meat and they sell the rest, and it's just really, really disgusting. And Upton Sinclair publishes this text and talks about how yes, this is based on stuff he learned seeing meat factories and meat packing plants and how unsanitary and awful it was with rats everywhere and like just absolute totally disgusting, nasty, stomach churning stuff. It really prompts public uproar and outrage. And in 1906, Congress passes the Pure Food and Drug Act, which prohibits the sale of disgusting adulterated food. And it's kind of it's the precursor to really the foundation for the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that regulates the conditions of food preparation before consumption. So the Pure Food and Drug Act really tried to, it was this is classic progressivism in action. There's a problem, someone does some muckraking like the jungle, and then there is government solution. Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, which prohibited the sale of adulterated or disgusting misbranded livestock. So, you can't sell roadkill raccoon and claim that it's pure filet mignon. Like there's consequences to this now. Um, it's no longer buyer beware. It's now you have a little bit of protection that the government is inspecting places. There are standards that companies can be held to. And people were really, it was disgusting in the 1900s. Food, you didn't know what you were getting really. There's nothing to regulate what goes into stuff that you're consuming. There's a big issue with um, bread making factories, bakeries would shave sawdust into their flour to kind of save money on grain, and people would just eat it. And then you have and so what? It's too bad. What are you going to do? Then just buy your bread from somewhere else. There's a lot of there are a lot of issues with this that they're hoping to change, using poisons, like really diluted poisons, to dye food and make it look nicer. You can't do that anymore because of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Again, just progressivism. This is progressivism in a nutshell, right in action. It's problem, raise a ruckus and uproar about it, and then the government passes acts to then protect people from that initial problem. Another issue that the progressives were looking at were working conditions. Those who were progressive reformers or advocates for progressivism turned to poor working conditions, especially for the urban poor. So people who were living in factories, who were living in cities and working in factories. They tried to uh, do something to change these conditions. And one of the issues that really drew a lot of attention to this problem and made it unavoidable and brought it into people's minds was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911. This was in New York City. There was a company called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, and Triangle Shirtwaist was a factory that created shirtwaists, which are basically just blouses. So it was a blouse factory making ladies' blouses. And the in 1911, there is a fire that breaks out in the building and it kills 146 of the workers who were employed by Triangle Shirtwaist. The investigation very quickly shows that it was the hazardous working conditions that caused the fire in the first place, but also the conditions of the building that made it so deadly. So what happened was, first and foremost, when the fire breaks out, it's due to how much dust is in the air because linen dust, it's just cloth fibers are all over the place in this factory. It's also made more so that the cramped conditions and the poor sanitation helps cause the fire in the first place and makes it spread. But it also becomes very quickly how the bad planning of the building made the fire deadly because it turns out that a lot of the fire hoses and ladders that the city fire department had was not tall enough to get up to the highest windows of the Triangle Shirtwaist building. You have fire ladders that only went up about half as high as the building was. So there were women, mostly women, working in the Triangle Shirtwaist factory that were forced to try, they would jump out of the windows because they couldn't reach to the ladders. The ladders weren't high enough, and the fire hoses weren't long enough to spray the fire as it broke out. So that encouraged a lot of change where now, yeah, you have to be able to reach the highest building with a fire company. There's regulations about that and regulations to put in place sprinkler systems in buildings because the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory didn't have that. There were also faulty fire exits that meant that when you opened the door that was marked fire exit, it went nowhere, or it was also there were a lot of locked doors. The owners of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory locked a lot of the doors because they didn't want the women who were working there to take unauthorized breaks or to steal any of the products. So they nowadays that's highly illegal because you have to have several exits in case there is a fire. In case the fire is blocking one, people have to be able to have a second way to get out. So a lot of these factors came together to show people that the factory owners had not done anything to protect the workers. There were a lot of problems that helped increase the death toll, and it becomes a rallying cry for reformers to pass laws that will prevent something like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire death toll from happening again. This cartoon, the locked door, showing all of the women racing to the fire exit only to find it locked, is very indicative of how they blamed the very dismissive the very dismissive practices of the factory owners for increasing the death toll. But the visibility of it, all of these things combined, how visible it was happening right there in Manhattan, women throwing themselves out of a burning building to their deaths. I mean, that gets attention. And a lot of reforms do come into place. New laws, progressivism in action, outrage, government response. And the government response is several different things where you're not allowed, you have to have fire exits that work. You have inspections to make sure people aren't locking doors and prevent and blocking fire exits. Um, you have to have fire engines that have ladders that are high enough. You have to have sprinklers in your buildings. Fire prevention, fire drills you have to host. If you have a certain amount of people working in a building, you have to have a fire drill so that they know the process of how to escape the building. And a lot of the reform efforts that are put in place because of the deadliness of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire are still felt today. If you've ever been in any type of academic building or large area, if you look over somewhere next time you're in a building like that, look at the wall, usually by the door. There'll usually be an occupancy placard on it that says this room has can only have a minimum of 43 persons inside. One of the classrooms I teach in has one right above the light switch. It says maximum occupancy 43 persons. That's a fire code reason. You can't have 200 people crammed in a tiny room because if there's a fire, they won't be able to all get out in time. And a lot of these reforms, a lot of these protective laws are put in place because of tragedies like this, very visible tragedies that happened because of all the problems that factories were faced with, like overcrowding and owners that were prioritizing their profits over their workers. This is something that a lot of reformers will latch onto. I mean, this cartoon is very much in favor of this is something really a dig against the factory owners for having locked the door and doomed all of these women to their deaths. And it's not just labor issues for adults that reformers are looking to fix, it's also child labor. This is a slide I stole from one of my previous lectures just to give you an overview of child labor. As a reminder, it was quite prevalent. In 1870, about 1 in 8 children worked, and it got the statistics only got worse by 1900, where 1 in 5 children were working, and they're working very young. You remember the ages were about 10 to 15 on average, but some child laborers were as young as 5 if the job was simple enough, like picking mollusks or gathering seafood or even just moving boxes around or something. But children often worked in very dangerous conditions where they could lose fingers, they could breathe in toxic dust all day if you were like the boys up top or coal miners. They would work sorting out coal. The girl below is working in a very dangerous textile factory where there's a lot of spinning, whirring parts where you can get your fingers and limbs stuck in. And there's no recourse if a child was injured. The only thing they would have to do is if they lost a limb, they were just fired. That was it. There's no workers' compensation in this day and age. You were just forced to then, if you couldn't work again, you were forced to go on public charity if you couldn't support yourself. So it's a very big problem. And one of the muckrakers, the progressive reformers who tries to rake the muck and reveal the truth, is Lewis Hine. And his whole way of attempting to change and reform child labor was to first and foremost draw attention to it. So a class of progressive inaction thing again. Problem, draw attention, and hope to bring about change. Lewis Hine was a photographer, and he was also, again, a progressive muckraker. And he was hired by the National Child Labor Committee in 1908 to document the lives of working children and show people how bad it was and how pitiable, how pathetic it was, how sad, how wrong it was to have little children working so hard. His pictures are quite famous today. There's a lot of very shocking ones. Some of the ones in the last slide were Lewis Hine pictures. He went around and took as many pictures as possible of working children, and he often labeled the back with the children's names and what they did and certain things that he found about them. This is Manuel, a shrimp picker. He's 5 years old, so he spends his entire days harvesting shrimp. I bet it smells really bad. He doesn't look very happy. There are lots of pictures of injured children, children like in coal mines. It's just absolutely heart-wrenching, and that was the point. And it's pretty successful. It takes a few years to grind through the legislative processes, but Hine's work revealing the despair behind child labor helps lead to the passage in 1916 of the Keating-Owen Act, which banned children under 14 years old from working, and it also shortened the days of children between the ages of like 15 and 18. Like they couldn't work as hard either. It was eventually found to be unconstitutional, the Keating-Owen Act, but by in the late 1930s, it's back on the books, and there are more protective child labor laws in place. But Lewis Hine, classic progressive, he saw a problem, he documented it, he made sure people were outraged and knew what was really going on, and it brought about a Reform Act. So let's go back now a little bit to labor because this is another thing that the real soul of progressivism is that people can improve their own lives and improve the world around them. It's also not just a lot of very middle class people advocating for reform because a lot of the food reformers and the child labor reformers were very middle class people. It was also lower class and poorer people who were advocating for change. And a big way that they did that was to try to unionize and create more advocacy for better working conditions, better hours, and better pay. So the progressive era does see a lot more unions cropping up because they're sort of breeding in this era that's a little bit more sympathetic to bringing about change in the workplace. A big one was the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886, that really takes off during this era, gets a lot more members. It grows quite well, but the AFL was seen as almost kind of backwards a little bit by the turn of the century. By 1900, 1910, 1905, they're seen as kind of behind the times because the AFL was very exclusive. The American Federation of Labor was a very exclusive workers' union. They excluded if you weren't white, male, or native born. So if you were like an Italian immigrant, you were not welcome in the AFL. So a lot of workers felt that was costing them their unity, that was making it difficult for them to work as one voice. So in response to that, the a lot of workers instead started to throw their support behind the International Workers of the World, the IWW, which was founded in 1905 to be a lot more inclusive and hopefully be stronger, stronger in numbers, as this cartoon illustrates. One big union of all the workers, everybody, color, sex, um, native status doesn't matter. They're stronger together, and only together can they blast the issues of low wages, long hours, and rotten conditions. So they were trying to uh, bring about more change by being a bit more open and being more accepting to other people. And this is again very much indicative of the change going on in the progressive era, where there is a bit more radical politics going on. There are more pushes for socialism, for free college educations, and more state ownership of the means of production, which is a fancy way of saying things like factories and railroads. So a lot of change going on in the progressive era, child labor, food reform, unionization, a lot happening. But let's now switch gears and talk about the women's movement because this is absolutely a big part of the progressive era, and it deserves to be talked about with the progressive era because it kind of shares that same soul of trying to identify a problem, make a big deal about it, and then bring about a legal change, a change on the books, a codified change that will help um, guarantee that all your efforts are noted. You want to see a result for all of your work. You're going on strike and you're hoping to see a new law about working hours. You're taking pictures of sad children. You're hoping that it will bring about a child labor law. And it's the same thing with the women's movement. They identify the problem of disenfranchisement in women. They do a lot of stuff to draw attention to it, as we'll talk about, and their goal is to bring about the change of legalizing the vote for women. They want to enfranchise them and get them suffrage. Those are interchangeable words in general. We're not going to split hairs here. Suffrage, enfranchisement, the right to vote, getting the ballot, all talking about just women being allowed to vote. Now, the early women's movement, it doesn't start in the progressive era. The push to get women the right to vote and to bring about more social equality for women, that doesn't immediately start in like 1900. Like, oh, it's the progressive era. Let's get women to vote. Yay. No, it's old. It's very old. It starts out really officially, historians consider 1848 with the Seneca Falls Convention back before the Civil War as the start of the women's movement, because women were trying to ride that wave of social change and throw in their efforts to get the right to vote along with the anti-slavery movement. If you remember, a lot of women became politically involved with abolition, trying to abolish slavery, and in those efforts, they kind of saw a lot of similarities to their own lack of rights and tried to use the momentum of ending slavery to also bring about social change for themselves. However, it's really kind of squashed. The Civil War makes the big focus ending slavery, and after the Civil War, the big focus is also trying to enfranchise black men because the thought was they really need the vote. They need to be able to vote in people that will help safeguard their new rights, that they were in much more desperate need of the right to vote for their own protection than women were. One of the famous quotes that kind of made the rounds prior the to that era was the reformer Wendell Phillips said, causes have their crises. That of the Negro has come. That of the women's rights movement has not yet come. That was Phillips essentially saying, this is, we need to first focus on slaves, ending slavery, and enfranchising black men for their own protection. Women can take a back seat. They can wait. It is not their hour yet. They are not, they're not in desperate need of the right to vote because their lives aren't at risk. But women were still advocating for that. They were advocating for their right to vote. They were even advocating for things like dress reform. This is the famous Amelia Bloomer, who tried to phase in at making it acceptable for women to wear pants because she thought that that would make them more active and that that would help them kind of be less subservient and stuck shuffling around in their big fat dresses, these big, massive, heavy hoop skirts. She was kind of pretty widely criticized for it, but there was attempts. So the women's movement is an older one, but it was definitely backburnered, put aside in favor of abolition, even after the Civil War. But women they try in several ways to not just get the right to vote, but also to become more politically active and to try to do some of their own reform too. So it's kind of twofold. There's a couple of things that women do where they are attempting to get their right to vote, but they're also attempting to be politically active and make some social change. One of the biggest ones that they try to do is to advocate for temperance or stop drinking alcohol. We've talked about this in the past, the temperance movements, where this was seen as a big social issue, alcohol consumption. A lot of women's groups, when they get political, they make it their goal to try to end or curtail heavily alcohol consumption. And one of the earliest national women's groups that was working towards temperance and just being political was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, founded in 1874 with the goal of legislating alcohol abstinence. So they didn't just want to discourage people from drinking, they wanted to make alcohol illegal. The sale and consumption of alcohol as just totally banned. If you drink it, you're a criminal. So they were pushing for this, and a lot of it they often staged it as a women's issue that alcohol consumption hurt women in particular. Therefore, it was up to women to become politically active to try to ban it. A big one was, women as mothers, and the drunken husband would come home and hurt them or just blow all of his money on alcohol, and moms and children would suffer because they would starve. So a lot of times, a lot of the literature that the WCTU put out was all about, protecting children, protecting their morals and their virtue, and often trying to just position themselves as the keepers of social progress and of social niceties and social mores. This is a very famous picture of the era that I don't think really helps their cause at all. The lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours picture. That one's a classic. You can't not show it when you're talking about the women's attempts to legislate temperance. So there you have it. I show that just for the historic value of it. But it was a women's issue. They wanted to do something to legislate temperance. Progressivism in action again. Problem, make a big deal about it, try to get a law on the books that solves the initial issue. But that aside, so I would be remiss to not talk about the WCTU because it is a very early women's political activism organization. But a big push that most women's organizations were aiming towards was trying to gain suffrage. They were trying to get women the right to vote. One of the earliest groups trying to meet that goal was the National American Women Suffrage Association, which is a mouthful, so it's called NAWSA for short. And it was founded in 1890 with the real goal uh, of trying to get women the right to vote and get them the ballot. And they are very progressive about it, so they make a big deal. They try to have parades and meetings and speeches and all sorts of stuff to keep the issue relevant and keep it in people's minds because a lot of Americans saw it as not a huge priority, that, women aren't being killed in droves, they're not being forced into labor camps or anything just because they can't vote. It was seen as kind of just an issue that could wait. It wasn't as pressing. There wasn't as much human suffering as during slavery, so it's not something that gets a lot of prioritization. So NASA was really hoping to just agitate, be very, maybe muckrake about it and show that there were issues. And for a while, it was difficult for them to justify why women should vote because there what problems were women facing? You couldn't have the same horror stories like there were during slavery to try to show that women need the right to vote now. As time marches on here and the Gilded Age comes about and there's more factories and women are working in those factories, NASA and a lot of women's rights activists see their moment where they start to see problems that they feel that getting the right to vote will solve for women. So women are looking for enfranchisement now because they feel that women are in danger. There is a problem that women need the right to vote to be able to solve, and that is unfair labor practices. A lot of women now, more so than ever, are working. They're working in factories. They're subject to dangerous working conditions, low wages. long hours, and a lot of women start to feel that this is the cause that they can get behind and say, hey, women need the right to vote because they need to be able to, as this poster says, to end sweatshops. By enfranchising them, they will be able to bring about change to help improve their own working conditions. You have women now suffering in factories because of all the poor treatment, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. You need women to have the right to vote so that they can try to start protecting themselves. So with more women out of that private sphere of the home, that private area of the home, and in now seen as more danger in society, it gives some more justification about why they need the right to vote. Because they need to vote in politicians who will look out for their interests, who will pass laws to give them better wages, and laws to protect their working hours, and laws that will force factories to create safe working conditions for the women there. So you do have a lot more active working women. They're becoming, and it's the women's suffrage movement is just growing too because women are more politically active. I mean, look at these women over here. They're taking part in a strike from the lady. They worked as tailors. They worked in seamstresses. They're striking. They're becoming politically active. Women really want the right to vote now too because they're seeing more of the politics. They feel that they're more educated and more capable of casting a ballot. But a big part is they want to vote to throw their weight behind labor laws that will protect them in factories. And even if you're not a working woman, even if you're a middle class woman who stays at home, you can see some of the solidarity there where they would say, okay, well, I see other women suffering. I want the right to vote to help them as well. So it starts to encourage a lot of women to try to get politically involved, and it gives them some more leverage to talk about how and why getting the right to vote is so important. Another thing going on here, so we talked about alcohol, temperance, and the WCTU trying to legislate an end to alcohol to protect women who suffered from people who drank alcohol. Women are trying to get more politically active to get the right to vote to protect factory workers. There's also another women's rights movement that's operating here, and it's the birth control movement pushing for access to accessible birth control. Because especially now with a lot of women working, they want to be able to sort of regulate better when their pregnancies are and have freedom from having children to be able to work or just to limit the amount of pregnancies that they had. One of the most famous advocates for giving women knowledge about birth control was a reformer named Margaret Sanger. And what she did was she was one of 11 children, and basically she saw her mother just fall apart from having so many kids and felt that a lot of other poor and tired women would have done better in life if they could have just limited the number of pregnancies that they had. So, Margaret Sanger often tried to publish columns on sex education in newspapers, like, okay, there are ways to prevent pregnancies, but it was very difficult for her to do so because it was considered obscene. Knowledge about sexual activity was just it actually violated some obscenity laws of the time where they tried to it was considered almost pornographic. This is one of the most famous images of the birth control movement. Margaret Sanger tried to publish a column called What Every Girl Should Know about birth control and sexual activity, and she would publish this and she tried to hand out pamphlets to educate people. It was just some tips about sexuality and sexual hygiene. What every girl should know. The post office often took out the text of it and put this big nothing in the middle, and then they would send it out. So it's very indicative of how much backlash Margaret Sanger received for attempting to educate women on birth control. She was actually jailed in 1916 for trying to distribute birth control measures and contraceptives to immigrant women to help them control the amount of pregnancies that they had. Um, so it was definitely this was one of the more the women's movement that had a lot of pushback to it because it was just seen as promiscuous. It was going to encourage a lot of promiscuity where women would be just rampantly having sex because they would not have the fear of getting pregnant from doing it, and it was just seen as encouraging a lot of devious behavior in women, and it was just something that they didn't want floating around society. That it was very crass and unbecoming to have this out there. So this was the birth control movement was definitely one that had a lot of detractors. And honestly too, so did the campaign for suffrage. I mean, that one's seen as kind of the noble one, like, oh, women just want the right to vote, and they're out there simply, running around with big signs trying to advocate for it. But they're actually pretty militant in it, and there is a lot of pushback against women getting the right to vote. The campaign for suffrage, it takes center stage in the progressive era, and a lot of and part of it is because a lot of women felt that almost every issue they had could be solved by the right to vote, if that was the thing that they needed first and foremost. And because if you have the right to vote, then okay, you can vote for things that will help with birth control, you can vote for food reform, you could vote for child labor, you could vote for alcohol abstinence laws and whatnot. Like this was the necessary start and the necessary beginning. And women in the progressive era could be very militant with and very public with their demands for enfranchisement, often going out and um, standing with signs and giving very loud speeches. And they do a lot of advertising, but sometimes their advocacy got them in a lot of trouble. Um, they could be quite militant about it. Sometimes they would like write votes for women on bricks and throw them through shop windows, or they would use acid to pour the words like votes for women on golf course lawns. So they did get in some trouble for it. But a lot of times, sometimes women just out picketing would be arrested for their advocacy, and were often treated quite brutal in prisons. This is an image of a women's suffrage advocate who was jailed for advocating for suffrage. And sometimes in England, especially, there was a sympathetic movement going on in England for English women to get the right to vote. And in English prisons, a lot of times the women would go on hunger strikes if they were arrested for suffrage campaigning, and then would then subsequently be force-fed because nobody wanted these women to starve to death in prison. So it was pretty violent. There was a lot of um, militant action on the part of the women themselves and a lot of harsh backlash against them, but they weren't quite as silenced as the birth control movement advocates were. And I would be absolutely remiss to not mention that it's not just, obviously people mostly think of men as kind of opposing women's suffrage, that women just aren't ready for the right to vote, but it's there's plenty of women that don't want women to vote. So there was an entire progressive era movement of anti-suffrage people who were a lot of women advocating for women to not have the right to vote. And they were called the anti-suffrage movement. More officially, they formed an organization called the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. I don't know what in the world that acronym is. NOUS something? I don't know. They don't have an acronym. They're just anti-suffragists. They're formed in 1911, and they were very adamant that enfranchising women and giving them the right to vote was a bad move, that this was a huge, massive, terrible mistake, and that most women didn't want the right to vote, that they were the real rational ones. The loud, noisy ones out there jumping up and down on a soapbox screaming about women's votes were just a noisy minority, as this poster said, do not be deceived by the noisy ones. They're making a spectacle of themselves. The majority of women don't want the right to vote. And a big reason why a lot of American women opposed women's enfranchisement was that they felt that it would cost women a lot of the special privileges they enjoyed, like basically being always the ones considered for getting children if a marriage broke up, that the children usually without fail went to the woman. They felt that there was some legal protections, that they were the dependents of their husband, and if they could vote, then if they're equal to their husbands and they weren't dependents anymore, what legal ramifications were there? They felt that a lot of women enjoyed very, very protected lives, and enjoyed being a dependent because that meant that they had a lot of these of protections like that, and they were also protected from being drafted. That was a big privilege that women enjoyed, was that they were totally exempt from a military draft. If the country goes to war, women are they're not even considered as part of the fighting force. It's all men. So a lot of women were very concerned that it would cost them those privileges like being a protected dependent and also being protected from a military draft. Women are also opposed to enfranchisement because a lot of them felt that it was just totally unnecessary, that they felt women as a whole were just not political beings, that they still didn't need it, that they were too uninformed. And a lot of women thought that, like, what's the point? You're going to have all of these women that are just going to vote the same way as their husbands, so nothing is really going to change politically. And there were even some women, like some men, that feared that this would lead to the collapse of the household. That if women are out being political and advocating for political change, who's going to take care of the kids? Who's going to keep the house running? So there is a lot of anti-suffrage sentiment, even on the part of women themselves. However, it's their efforts to advocate for not enfranchising women are unsuccessful, and eventually, by 1920, women do have the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And this really, I'm going to say it one more time, progressivism in action. You had a problem, advocacy, and a law on the books as the final thing, an amendment to the Constitution that it really comes full circle here. The 19th Amendment guarantees women the right to vote. This is part of the text of the 19th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So that means women can't be barred from voting just because they're women. It passes in Congress in June 1919 and it's officially ratified. So it's an official law on the books, an official amendment by August 18th, 1920. And part of the reason why it finally passes is a mix of the continued advocacy of women for arguing why women should have the right to vote, just because they're citizens, just like men, because they needed to be able to advocate for change to protect themselves. They follow the laws, they should have a say in the laws that are being made. Um, but also because, and we'll talk about this very soon, I think we'll talk about this next, actually, if you're watching these in order or doing this in order. Um, the First World War happens. In 1914, Europe breaks out into an extremely deadly conflict, and the United States gets involved by 1917. A big reason the United States gets involved in the First World War is to make the world safe for democracy. They want to help make the world a place where democratic governments can thrive and flourish. And all of this rhetoric about democracy during the First World War gives women even more leverage, where they can say, hey, democracy, we don't even have it. You're not really a democratic government if you don't let all of your citizens vote. So they're able to use that as justification, and they're also able to use their participation in the war as justification for how they would make good citizens. A lot of women get involved in Red Cross activity, they get involved in auxiliary units, they do a lot of fundraising. They are they're very concerned about the welfare of their nation, and they feel that they've demonstrated it quite well by the way that they rise to the occasion during the First World War. And when they do that, they are able to kind of use this once the war ends. World War I ends in 1918. That's why it's not too long after the end of the war in November 1918 that the 19th Amendment goes through Congress by June 1919. So they're able to use the actions that they had taken during the First World War to help really finally get that one last push over the final resistance to women's suffrage. And it's one of the many, many, many important results of the First World War. But I will, as just more a bit of a recap, it is kind of a mix of their continuing agitation for change as well as the First World War, but also another reason why the First World War is so remarkably important too, and another one of the effects of that very important conflict.